I am very proud to introduce to you Stéphanie Payet. She works today as an analyst at OECD's private pensions unit. She has more than 10 years of experience in this field, especially private pension systems around the world. She is also the main author of the 2018 publication Financial Incentives and Retirement Savings and co-writer of the report towards improved retirement savings outcomes for women. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hello, hey. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to share my screen and make a presentation of the latest report of the OECD about improving retirement savings outcome for women. Can you see the slides?
Yes, at least I can see the slides.
Okay, perfect. Basically, we started from trying to understand where the gender pension gap is coming from. And we started to measure this gender pension gap. In this graph, you can see the gender pension gap in different OECD countries, which is measured as the difference between the average pension income of men and the average pension income of women, combining both public and private sources of pension income and divided by the pension income of men. And what you clearly see is that in all OECD countries, you have a gender pension gap. And on average in the OECD, women aged 65 and above receive 26% less pension income than men. This number for Sweden is slightly above, at 28%. And Sweden lies basically in the middle of the range when you look at the OECD countries overall. But then from that moment on, we really focus on the role of retirement savings arrangements to that overall gender pension gap. And here first I want to make a disclaimer of what we mean at the OECD when we talk about retirement savings arrangements. And in the Swedish context, that would be both the occupational pensions and the private individual pensions. So please just bear that in mind, that when I'm talking about retirement savings arrangements, I'm talking about both types of products. And what we expect looking at the data and the trends is that the role of these retirement savings arrangements will increase in the gender pension gap over time. There are several reasons for that. One of them is that in many countries, there is the expectation that private retirement savings arrangements should be more and more used as a complement to public pay-as-you-go pensions to finance retirement income. So the importance of these arrangements is increasing. And also because there are differences between men and women in how they use the retirement savings arrangement. First of all, women are less able to access a plan in many countries because there are countries where the provision of an occupational pension plan is voluntary for employers. And therefore, in some sectors or some industries, women don't have access to a pension plan. And even when they do have access to a pension plan, if participation is voluntary, they tend to be less likely to join that pension plan to which they have access. So overall, we see that in many countries, coverage of retirement savings plans is lower among women than among men. We also see from the data that women make lower and less frequent contributions compared to men. And the last point is that we know that women have, on average, longer life expectancies. That means that even if they have accumulated the same amount of assets in a defined contribution pension plans, for example, those assets will have to last for longer, meaning that they will have lower income every year, but potentially for longer. So all of this makes us think that the contribution of retirement savings arrangements to the overall gender pension gap is expected to increase in the future. And one key thing to keep in mind is that there is a close link between the labor market and the retirement income that people can get from these arrangements. Because the labor market status of individuals directly affects their ability to access a plan, but also the entitlements that they can build into those plans. So unfortunately, we couldn't include Sweden in those graphs, but these graphics show that in many OECD countries, there is a gender gap in the assets accumulated in retirement savings arrangements. Sometimes quite significant, the gap between men and women. And the graph on the right shows that when we break down the retirement assets accumulated by gender and by age group, we see that this gap between men and women actually emerges in the age group 25 to 34, which corresponds more or less to the time when women take time off the labor force to care for the first child. And then we can see that the gap in retirement assets increases as people get older. So we also look at what are the drivers of this gender pension gap, because if we understand the drivers, then we can act and we can find policy options to solve this problem. And clearly the main driver is our labor market differences between men and women. First of all, women tend to participate less in the labor market than men. On average in the OECD, only 50% of women aged 15 to 64 have a job, and this is 66% for men in the OECD. The numbers are less dramatic, I would say, in Sweden, because it's 65% of women and 70% of men have a job in Sweden, but there is still a gap between men and women in Sweden. And this means that because women participate less in the labor market, this means also that they will have shorter careers. And this is also related to the fact that they take time off to take care of some family members, either children or older family members. Women also make up the big part of the part-time workforce. On average in the OECD, 70% of all part-time workers are women. And this is a phenomenon that is also applying in Sweden. 30% of all women work part-time, and this is even greater when we focus on blue-collar women. It's 48% among blue-collar women. And even when women work full-time, there is still today a wage gap between men and women. On average in the OECD is 13%, is slightly less in Sweden at 10%. So all of this means that women accumulate less entitlements of their own, and they will be more reliant on the retirement entitlements of their partners. But beyond labor market drivers, there are also behavioral, social, and cultural factors that play a role in the gender gap in retirement savings. The first one is risk aversion. We looked at the literature, and there are many studies that show that women are more risk averse than men. And this implies that they may choose investment strategies that are more conservative. And in the long term, that means they have a reduced potential performance on their retirement savings compared to men. There are also many studies showing that women have lower levels of financial literacy compared to men. This means that they have more difficulties in understanding the workings of retirement savings arrangements, and there are a lot of many complex decisions that need to be made in the context of retirement savings. There are a lot of concepts to understand, like the compound interest, like the effect of inflation. And given all these complexities and the difficult decisions that need to be made, women tend to just give up on retirement savings because it's too complex. Men and women also tend to have different attitudes towards savings. With women tend to prioritize current spending for themselves or for their family members. So they think less about themselves in the future. They really think about their well-being today. Marital status is also an important social factor, and there is an important distinction here to make between couples and single individuals. Because the financial decisions within a couple may shift from one person to the other. So, for example, if you have the man who is more financially literate, then you can have better decisions made within the couple. But also couples may be able to mutualize their pension savings, and this is not accessible to people living alone. But then the other side of the coin is that the consequences of divorce or widowhood over retirement savings may be worse for women than for men. I will talk about this a bit later, but there are some of the design of retirement savings arrangements that may not be in line with the fact that women, if they take time off the labor force to care for family members, they will not accumulate entitlements of their own. And that's why it's important that if there is a divorce, the entitlements built by the man on behalf of the whole couple will be divided between the two ex-spouses. Gender stereotyping is also an important behavioral factor. It still drives educational and career choices, with women still underrepresented in the field of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, for example. Also, gender stereotypings mean that women are often the primary family caregiver, because we have this idea that the role of women is to take care of the children, for example. And a further impact is that financial advisors themselves may have unconscious bias. They know that women are more risk-averse than men, but they may even go further than that and advise women on overly conservative investment options because of this unconscious bias. And the last point is communication. Men and women do not necessarily perceive the same information in the same way, depending on how it is presented, how it is framed. And also it is important when governments build communication campaigns to distinguish the specific needs of men and women, because women, we know, they participate less in the labor market, they contribute less in their retirement savings plan. So it's important to take this into account when building communication campaigns to make sure that the message goes through men and women. And the data show that there have been progress in terms of the gender pension gap. It has been going down in many countries. But unfortunately, the crisis that we are living in today, COVID-19 crisis, is threatening to increase again the gender pension gap in the future. First, because the COVID-19 has labor market impacts that have impacted actually women potentially more than men, because they are likely to work in sectors that have been more impacted by the COVID-19, such as tourism, hospitality. They are also more likely to be in positions that are more vulnerable to layoffs because they work part-time or on temporary contracts, but also because they may have taken time off work to bear the additional educational and caretaking burdens of their children. But there are also some indirect impacts of the COVID-19 that may be more detrimental for women. There are a number of countries, for example, that have allowed individuals to withdraw part of their retirement savings to face contingencies. But given that women tend to have lower assets accumulated already, they are more likely to actually empty their retirement savings pot and have nothing left to finance their retirement. Women are also less likely to benefit from the recovery of financial markets because, as I mentioned earlier, they tend to have more conservative investment options. So maybe they have suffered less from the drop in financial markets in the first quarter of 2020, but they have not benefited from the recovery that followed during the last 3 quarters of 2020. And finally, there are also studies showing that because of COVID-19, the number of divorce cases has increased because of the lockdowns in particular. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some aspects of the design of retirement savings plans that may not allow people to divide the assets upon divorce. So in this report, what we have done is try to put women at the center and find solutions to improve retirement savings outcome for women. The idea is not that the design of these arrangements will solve all the problems on Earth, and they will not be able to address all the drivers of the pension gap, in particular those coming from the labor market. But they should strive to reduce the impact that these factors have on the retirement income that women may get, or at the very least, they should ensure that the existing inequalities are not exacerbated by the design of the arrangement. So in that sense, those retirement savings arrangements should aim to be gender neutral. So we have identified 7 groups of policies to improve the situation for women. The first one is to make sure that women have access to a retirement savings plan, in particular at the workplace, because there are a number of countries where this is at the discretion of employers, unlike Sweden, and the industries where women are represented may not be the one where there is access to retirement savings plan. Once women have access to a plan, we should make sure that they do participate in those plans. And this is where you can use financial incentives to promote saving for retirement for women. We can talk about it later during the discussion, but also it's important to have a financial education workshop targeted at women to make sure that they understand the importance of having their own retirement income entitlements and not just relying on those of their partner. Then it's important to find solutions to make sure that women contribute regularly to their retirement savings arrangements. Again, you can have specific financial incentives for that. One important thing as well is to subsidize, for example, the contributions of women while they are on maternity leave. And this is the case in many countries, including Sweden for the occupational plans and for the PPM system. Another thing that is important is to make sure that the design of retirement savings arrangement is compatible with the career patterns of women. For example, allowing for flexible contributions or making sure that the fee structure of the system is not penalizing people with low retirement assets accumulated. Then you need to make sure that women can have good investment returns for their retirement savings, and this means avoiding conservative default investment strategies, for example. Another point is to make sure that women can achieve financial independence in retirement, and this means making sure that they have their own retirement income entitlements. And one example of that is making sure that retirement assets and retirement rights can be divided between the ex-partners upon divorce. And the last point is to address issues of longevity. We know that women have longer life expectancy on average. So that means that they need survivor pensions, for example, or they also need retirement income products that will increase in value over time so that they do not lose purchasing power, so index, for example, to inflation. So these are the 7 categories or groups of policies that we have identified to improve the situation for women in retirement savings. And now I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Many thanks for your interesting presentation, Stephanie. Before we open the floor to some questions from the audience, I would like to put a few myself. The existence of gender pension gaps is obviously worldwide, but you show that it's even larger in Sweden, and you also talked about different drivers. What would you say are the main driver for the Swedish result?
So it's difficult to really identify one factor compared to the other countries, because what we have to bear in mind is that the pension gap that we observe today on the pensioner population is the result of past situation of the labor market. So even though today we, as I mentioned, the situation of the labor market in Sweden is actually quite much better than the OECD average in terms of participation of women in the labor market. The wage gap is lower. This means that over time, the position of Sweden, let's say, will probably go down because it's doing better than the OECD average. But this is a picture of what has happened in the last 40 years. And unfortunately, I don't know exactly how things have evolved in Sweden compared to other countries. One thing that I thought was a bit specific to Sweden is that there is this occupational pensions at the sector or industry level, and you have this particularity that for high-income earners in some industries, their contribution rate is much higher. It's like 30%, as opposed to for the lower earner, it's 4.5%. So I understand that this is somehow to compensate for ceilings in the public pension system, but I wonder whether it would be worthwhile to have a really analysis of the consequences of this big difference in the occupational pension system and understand really the how it plays by gender, and whether it could be one of the factors that explain why Sweden, compared to other Nordic countries, may not be as good in that graph.
Yeah, we're talking about Nordic countries. Could you say a bit more if you compare Sweden with some other Nordic countries?
Yeah, so from the graph I showed you, Norway is about in the same part of the chart, let's say, is comparable to Sweden, but we see that Iceland, Finland, and Denmark have much lower gender pension gaps. So again, it could be linked to the history of the pension system of those countries compared to Sweden, to explain why the situation today among the pensioner population is better in these countries compared to Sweden.
Thank you. What would you say? How could we increase the interest for retirement savings among women and low-income earners?
Well, there are a number of things that could be done, because I understand that you have this objective of developing private individual savings again in Sweden. And if we want women to be part of this, as I mentioned, there are a number of things you could do, like financial incentives. I can discuss more about the different design of financial incentives to make sure that women understand those incentives and act upon them. Another important factor is to make sure that they understand what is at stake, because there are these cultural and behavioral factors that are at play as well. It's important to understand them, to make sure that the communication, when you communicate to women, that they actually understand the importance of having their own retirement savings entitlements, not just depending on the one of their partner. And also the importance of regular savings to their arrangements, not just once in a while and then forgetting about them. So communication, financial education, workshop that can be at the workplace. There are a number of studies that show that these types of workshops work pretty well. There are also some countries who have implemented specific communication campaigns and coverage campaigns at the workplace, where, because they targeted only women and they explained to women the incentives that were provided, they managed to increase coverage among women much more than among men, because there was this targeted aspect.
Mm. A question which is related to what you just have said from the audience is, what are the pros and cons of, if you compare with tax deductions and matching contributions on the other hand?
Yeah, so the main difference is who do you want to benefit from the financial incentive? So there are indeed two groups of financial incentives: the tax incentives that rely on the tax code, and the non-tax incentives. So let's start with the tax incentives. Again, here you have several groups, but the most common one, let's say, is to be able to deduct the contributions you've made to your retirement savings plan from your taxable income, which means that because of that, your taxable income is lower, so you pay less taxes today. And usually this is together with no tax on the returns, or a lower tax on the return than what you would have in another savings vehicle, and a taxable pension income. So that's what we call exempt, because the contributions are not taxed, exempt because the returns are not taxed, and tax. And this type of financial incentive is, the studies show that they are more valuable for high income earners. First of all, because they are the ones who pay income tax in the first place. There are some countries where the low income earners don't pay income tax at all. So if you give them a tax deductibility of contributions, they don't get anything out of it. While the high income earners are the ones who can benefit from it, and the higher their income, the higher their tax bracket is, and the higher will be their deduction, because then the contribution that they will deduct from their income tax will be more valuable to them. So that's one. And that's why a number of countries, to make sure that the incentive is also valuable for low-income earners, they either shift or complement these tax incentives with non-tax financial incentives. And we have two categories here of non-tax financial incentives: the matching contributions and the nominal subsidies. So with a matching contribution, every time an individual contributes 10 krona, the state, for example, we decide to contribute half of what you put. So for example, 5. So in your account, directly, you have 15 krona, even though you only contributed 5. So this type of incentive, there are a lot of countries that show that even though they could be completely equivalent to a tax deduction, because people understand them better, because the money is directly in their account, they react to that incentive much more. And this is especially the case for low-income earners. First, because the tax deduction maybe was no value to them. So then here they see the value immediately, because it doesn't depend on your income. Although there are some countries that do cap this matching contribution to make sure that the high-income earners do not get disproportionately higher incentive. And the second category of non-tax financial incentive is the nominal subsidies. So in that case, the value that is put in your account by the government, for example, is not a proportion of your own contribution, it's just a fixed amount. So, and because this is a fixed amount, it is much more valuable for the low-income earners than for the high-income earners, simply because it represents a higher share of their own income. So 100 krona for a low-income earner means much more than the same 100 krona for a high-income earner. So if you want to target the low-income earners, nominal subsidies are much more interesting. So in the chapter, we see that given that women tend to be in the lower income groups, matching contributions or nominal subsidies are likely to be more valuable to them, and they are likely to understand them better and to react to those incentives much more.
Very interesting, Stephanie. So in your view, do you hear me?
Yeah.
That's good. So in your view, if you want to target to lower the gender gap and also low income owner, non-tax incentives is much better, much more efficient.
Indeed.
Okay.
Yeah, there are studies that show that the countries who have done that, they have managed to target the low-income earners, such as Germany, for example. It could be one example for you to look at, because they have this type of non-tax subsidy type of non-tax financial incentive.
I'm afraid that we have some other speakers. I'm very sorry for that, Stephanie, because it was very interesting. So we'll speak to each other later, so to speak. But many thanks, Stephanie, and for making your presentation and asking the questions.
Thank you very much, Magnus. Tack, and goodbye.
Goodbye.